Welcome to Dark Whispers. Out here in the vast, ancient backbone of the Appalachian Mountains, there are stories that locals don't share in the daylight. Stories spoken only when the fire burns low, when the forest has gone unnaturally quiet, when even the cicadas seem to hold their breath. Tonight, I bring you 8 encounters, reported by hikers, rangers, miners, and travelers, each one too strange, too unsettling, too deeply rooted in the old bones of these mountains to ever find a simple explanation. These aren't legends polished by storytelling. These are the encounters people wish they could forget. 1. The Lantern Walker of Blackroot Ridge. Elias, an experienced hiker, knew the Blackroot Ridge trails better than most. But late one October night, he saw something he had never encountered before, a dim, wavering lantern light drifting between the trees, moving with a steady, unnatural rhythm. He called out, assuming another hiker was lost. The lantern stopped. The forest grew silent. Then, slowly, the light began moving toward him. The closer it came, the more Elias realized the lantern wasn't being held by a person. It floated at chest height, swinging gently as if guided by an invisible hand. When it reached the edge of the trail, Elias turned and ran. But the last thing he heard before escaping to the ranger station was the sound of soft footsteps behind him, even though the lantern had no one holding it. 2. The cabin that shouldn't have been there. A young couple exploring abandoned mining land found a small, rotting cabin the locals insisted had burned down decades earlier. Curious, they stepped inside. Dust covered everything except one thing, a fresh set of footprints leading from the doorway into a back room. But the back room had no door, no windows, no exit, just a solid, unbroken wall. Yet the footprints went straight into it, as if someone had simply walked through. That night, the couple camped half a mile away. Around 3 a.m., a knock came at their tent. 3 slow taps, then silence. When they peeked outside, there was nothing, except a new set of footprints in the dirt, leading from the direction of the impossible cabin. 3. The Screaming Hollow. Charlotte was hunting in a dense stretch of forest long known by locals as Screaming Hollow. Most dismiss the name as old mountain superstition, until she heard it herself. At first it sounded like a woman crying far off in the woods. But as Charlotte listened, the voice changed, stretching, distorting, becoming something no human throat could make. The crying became laughter. The laughter became choking gasps. And then it began calling her name. Charlotte never told anyone how she managed to run back to her truck without looking behind her, but she did say one thing. Whatever that thing was, it already knew I was coming. 4. Footsteps in the endless fog. A dense fog settled over Blue Ash Pass one evening, so thick that Ranger Dale could barely see his boots. As he hiked the trail to check for stranded campers, he heard footsteps behind him, measured, heavy, deliberate. He assumed it was a hiker following too closely, so he called out for them to keep distance. The footsteps stopped. Dale turned. Nothing. He started walking again. The footsteps resumed, this time closer, right behind him, like someone matching his pace exactly. When he finally broke into a clearing where the fog thinned, the footsteps ceased entirely. But in the mud along the trail behind him, there were no tracks. Not human, not animal, nothing at all. 5. The Man with No Face on Frostline Trail. Teens love Frostline Trail for ghost hunts, and most nights nothing happens. But one winter evening, JC saw a figure standing in the woods, watching her. At first, she thought it was a ranger. Then she realized his head was smooth and featureless, as if someone had sculpted a human form from wax but forgot to carve the face. He tilted his head, as though studying her. Then he stepped out onto the trail. JC ran, and when she reached the trailhead, she turned back to see if he followed. The woods were empty, but a fresh line of footprints trailed behind her, all the way to the exact spot she first saw him standing. 6. Something in the river. Fisherman Lewis often cast his line in the deep waters near Buckthorn Bend. One twilight evening, he saw something pale floating downstream. Thinking it was a deer carcass, he waded in, but as he approached, the pale shape rose upright, its limbs thin and impossibly long. It stared at it with eyes too reflective, like wet glass. Lewis froze. The creature tilted its head and sank beneath the surface without making a ripple. He never fished that river again. 7. The midnight knocker of Slate Creek. At exactly 12:03 a.m. every night, an old boarded-up church on Slate Creek echoes with a single knock. Locals say it's been happening for over a century. One night, 2 brothers camped near the church, determined to debunk the tale. When the knock came, it wasn't from the church door. It came from their tent. 8. The whispers in the abandoned tunnel. Deep below an old mining road lies Tunnel 17, long collapsed and sealed off with metal barriers. A group of urban explorers removed the fencing and stepped inside. They recorded faint whispers on their cameras, voices overlapping, frantic, desperate. But when they played the audio back later, they heard something chilling. The whispers weren't just random sounds. They were repeating the explorers' names. One by one. Most people who encounter something strange in the Appalachians try to move on. They tell themselves it was just an animal or the wind or their imagination. But some experiences don't fade. They cling like cold fingers at the back of the mind, replaying the quiet hours, forcing the question no one wants answered. If these mountains hold things we can't explain, what else might be watching from the dark? What follows are the aftermaths and deeper truths behind the 8 encounters. Truths the witnesses never wanted to revisit, but couldn't escape. 1. What followed Elias down the ridge? After seeing the floating lantern, Elias thought the nightmare was over once he reached the ranger station. But 2 nights later, he woke to a faint glow outside his window. There, between the trees, the lantern swayed again, quiet, patient, waiting. The rangers investigated, but nothing was found. The next morning, Elias found a trail of ash footprints leading up to the wall of the station and vanishing into it. He left the mountains forever. Even now, he refuses to sleep near windows. 2. The cabin that moves. The couple who discovered the impossible cabin tried to locate it again weeks later to prove they weren't hallucinating. But the forest had changed. Landmarks were gone. Trails ended abruptly. And where the cabin had been, there was nothing but thick underbrush and a patch of dead soil. 3 months later, a hunter miles away reported finding a cabin exactly matching their description, including the same footprints that walked into a wall. Locals now whisper it isn't a cabin at all, but something pretending to be one, changing locations, pulling in anyone curious enough to step through its doorway. 3. The thing in Screaming Hollow. Charlotte never returned to Screaming Hollow, but the thing that called her name didn't stop. She heard again 6 months later, while cleaning her barn, faint, drawn out, like distant weeping drifting down the valley. Her dog refused to leave the house that night. The old-timers say the hollow mimics the voices of people who passed through it, keeping them like trophies. If it calls your name once, it remembers you, forever, for footsteps that don't belong to anything living. Ranger Dale set up audio equipment across Blue Ash Pass after his fog encounter. For days, nothing happened. Then, on a fog-heavy morning, the recorders picked up footsteps circling one of the sensors. Slow, methodical, unhurried. But the camera beside it captured absolutely nothing. Not even shifting foliage. Not even an insect. The audio ended with a single whisper. Behind. Dale quit his job the same week. 5. The faceless man returns. JC tried to convince herself she imagined the faceless man, until her younger brother saw him too. He described the same smooth, pale head, the same stiff posture, the same way it tilted its head, like a confused animal. The scariest part wasn't that he saw the figure. It was where he saw it, standing at the edge of the woods behind their house, staring directly at JC's bedroom window. 6. The river creature doesn't stay in the water. After Lewis saw the pale creature rise from the river, strange things started happening around Buckthorn Bend. Dogs refused to drink from the water. The fish population plummeted. Several campers reported hearing splashing footsteps around their tents at night. Footsteps too heavy to belong to deer, too irregular to be human. One man claimed he saw long, wet fingers sliding around the outside of his tent, pressing inward. When he shined a light, they vanished. But the wet prints they left behind didn't match any known animal. Locals now call the river the Stillwater. They say once something rises from its depths, Part of it stays on land. 7. The midnight knocker isn't knocking from outside. The brothers who camped by the church swore the knock came from their tent, but they left out one detail, because even they couldn't accept it. They admitted later that before the knock, they heard footsteps inside the abandoned church, moving slowly up the aisle. But the church had no floor, just earth, no footprints, no tracks, nothing that could make steps sound like leather on wood. Locals believe the knock is a warning, one that means, you shouldn't be here. No one who's heard it twice ever stays the night again. 8. The tunnel whispers won out. When the explorers replayed the audio and discovered the whispers knew their names, they were terrified. But it got worse. One of them heard whispering again days later, this time inside her apartment, coming from a hallway. Another began sleepwalking and waking up at his front door, hand on the knob, as if someone on the other side was calling him out. The last member of the group went back to the tunnel to seal it off, believing closing it would silence whatever they had awakened. He never finished the job. His camera was found just inside the entrance, recording nothing but darkness, and faint voices whispering a new phrase over and over. Let us out. The truth beneath the Appalachians. For all its beauty, the Appalachian Range is ancient, older than the Rockies, older than the Himalayas, older than most of the world's living forests. And some believe that age holds things deeper than rock and root, things that borrow shapes, things that listen, things that remember. Some wander the ridgelines carrying lights no human hand can hold. Some mimic the living. Some search for new voices. Some want you to open the door. And some just wait. These mountains do not forget the people who pass through them. And once you've heard their whispers, you never walk alone again.